Case 1. Christie Michelle Scott. The fire that revealed a mother's rage. September 6, 2008. Russellville, Alabama. A quiet Saturday morning that would end in flames and death. Christie Michelle Scott was 30 years old, a mother of 2 boys living in what neighbors described as a modest home in a working-class neighborhood. To outsiders, she seemed like any other single mother trying to make ends meet. But behind closed doors, Christie harbored a rage that had been building for months, a rage directed at her 6-year-old son, Mason. Mason Scott was different. He'd been diagnosed with autism, and like many children on the spectrum, he required extra patience, extra care, and extra attention. For Christie, this wasn't a challenge to embrace with love. It was a burden she increasingly resented. Friends later told investigators that Christie had grown frustrated with Mason's needs, complaining that he was too much to handle and that she couldn't take it anymore. That September morning, Christie made a decision that would seal her fate and end her child's life. While her other son, Noah, was away at a sleepover, Christie set her plan in motion. She soaked Mason's mattress with gasoline. She spread accelerant throughout his bedroom. And then, with her autistic 6-year-old son inside, she lit the match. The fire erupted with terrifying speed. Flames consumed Mason's room, black smoke billowing from the windows as neighbors called 911. Firefighters arrived within minutes, battling the blaze as Christie stood outside, playing the role of the distraught mother. She screamed. She cried. She begged them to save her baby. But when firefighters finally reached Mason's room, what they found told a different story. The little boy's body was discovered in his bed, overcome by smoke and flames. The fire's point of origin was unmistakable. It had started in Mason's bedroom, and the burn patterns indicated accelerant use. This was no accident. This was murder. As investigators combed through the charred remains of the Scott home, Christie's story began to fall apart. She claimed she'd been outside when the fire started, that she had no idea how it could have happened. But forensic evidence painted a damning picture. Traces of gasoline were found throughout Mason's room. The fire had been deliberately set, and Christie was the only adult present in the home. When confronted with the evidence, Christie's demeanor changed. The grieving mother act dropped, replaced by cold defiance. She offered no credible explanation for the accelerant, no reasonable alternative theory, nothing that could explain away the physical evidence that proved she'd intentionally set fire to her son's bedroom while he slept inside. The investigation also revealed disturbing details about Mason's life before his death. Teachers and caseworkers had noticed bruises on the boy. Neighbors reported hearing Christie yelling at Mason with unusual intensity. One witness told police that Christie had once said she wished Mason had never been born. The autism that made Mason special, that made him need extra love and support, had instead made him a target of his own mother's rage. In 2009, Christie Michelle Scott was arrested and charged with capital murder. The prosecution argued that she'd killed Mason because she saw him as a burden, because his special needs were too inconvenient for her lifestyle, because she wanted him gone. The defense tried to suggest the fire was accidental, but the forensic evidence was overwhelming. The trial laid bare the horror of Mason's final moments. Experts testified about how the fire would have spread, how the smoke would have filled his lungs, how the 6-year-old boy would have suffered before death took him. The jury heard about the gasoline-soaked mattress, about Christie's suspicious behavior after the fire, about her complete lack of credible explanation for her son's death. On May 13, 2010, the jury returned with their verdict, guilty of capital murder. The sentencing phase was equally swift. The aggravating factors were clear. Mason was a child, vulnerable, dependent on his mother for protection. She'd violated that sacred trust in the most brutal way imaginable. The jury recommended death. The judge agreed. Christie Michelle Scott was sentenced to death and sent to Alabama's Tutwiler Prison for Women, where she remains on death row today. She's filed appeals, arguing everything from ineffective counsel to improper jury instructions. Every single appeal has been denied. The evidence against her is simply too strong, too clear, too damning. As of now, Christie sits in a cell, awaiting the day Alabama will execute her for murdering her autistic son. She'll never hold another child. Never walk freely through a park on a Saturday morning. Never experience the life she stole from Mason. 6-year-old Mason Scott loved trains. He loved the color blue. He loved his brother Noah. And he deserved a mother who would love him back, autism and all. Instead, he got Christie Michelle Scott, and it cost him everything. If this case has affected you, if you want to see more deep dives into verified true crime cases that matter, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to Cold Case Revisited. We're committed to telling these stories with the truth and respect the victims deserve. Case 2. Rhonda Belle Martin, Alabama's Angel of Death. Long before the term serial killer entered the public consciousness, Alabama had one operating in plain sight. Her weapon wasn't a gun or a knife. It was rat poison. And her victims weren't strangers. They were the people who loved her most. Rhonda Belle Martin was born in 1916 in Alabama, growing up during the Great Depression and poverty that shaped her worldview. She married young, as was common in that era, and began a pattern that would continue throughout her adult life, marrying men, having children, and then watching them die under mysterious circumstances. Her first husband, Claude D. Martin, died in 1937 after a brief illness characterized by severe stomach pain and vomiting. Doctors attributed it to natural causes. Rhonda collected a small insurance policy and moved on. She married again. Her second husband, Joe Neal Robbins, died in 1940 after similar symptoms. Again, natural causes were listed. Again, Rhonda collected insurance money. But it was her children who would suffer the most from Rhonda's poisonous touch. Between 1937 and 1951, Rhonda gave birth to several children. At least 3 of them, some sources say 4, died in childhood from what doctors called acute gastroenteritis or childhood illness. The symptoms were always the same: violent stomach cramps, uncontrollable vomiting, convulsions, and death. In an era before sophisticated toxicology, these deaths raised eyebrows, but no alarms. Child mortality was higher then. Illness could strike quickly. Doctors signed death certificates, and Rhonda buried her babies with public sympathy and, often, insurance payouts. Her third husband, Ronald Martin, died in 1951. Same symptoms, same mysterious illness, same insurance collection. Rhonda was becoming wealthy from death, and nobody had connected the dots. It was her mother, Dolly Haynes, whose death finally unraveled Rhonda's deadly scheme. In 1951, Dolly fell ill while living with Rhonda. The elderly woman suffered the now familiar symptoms: agonizing stomach pain, vomiting, weakness. But this time, a doctor became suspicious. The symptoms were too acute, too severe, too consistent with poisoning. When Dolly Haynes died on March 24, 1951, the doctor insisted on an autopsy. The toxicology report was damning: massive amounts of arsenic in Dolly's system. Not from environmental exposure or accident, but from deliberate, repeated poisoning. Someone had been feeding Dolly Haynes rat poison, and there was only one person with opportunity and access: her daughter, Rhonda. When police began investigating Dolly's death, they discovered something that made their blood run cold. They started looking at all the other deaths surrounding Rhonda Belle Martin. They exhumed bodies. They ran toxicology tests on preserved tissue samples. And they found arsenic in victim after victim after victim. Her first husband, poisoned. Her second husband, poisoned. Her third husband, poisoned. Her infant daughter, poisoned. Her son, poisoned. Her other children, poisoned. Her mother, poisoned. Even her mother-in-law had died under suspicious circumstances after living with Rhonda. The investigation revealed that Rhonda had been purchasing rat poison regularly for years. She would mix it into food, into drinks, into anything her victims would consume. She would administer it in doses small enough to cause illness but not immediate death, making it look like a natural illness. Then, as her victims weakened, she'd increase the dosage until they died. All the while, she played the grieving wife, the devastated mother, the dutiful daughter. She collected sympathy. She collected insurance money. And she killed again. When confronted, Rhonda initially denied everything. But as the evidence mounted, exhumed bodies, positive arsenic tests, insurance policies, purchase records for rat poison, her story changed. In a stunning confession, Rhonda Belle Martin admitted to murdering 6 people, including her own children. Some reports suggest the actual victim count may have been higher, possibly reaching into double digits. Her motive was chillingly simple: money and convenience. She killed her husbands for insurance payouts. She killed her children when they became burdensome or when insurance policies made them more valuable dead than alive. She killed her mother for the inheritance. Each death funded Rhonda's lifestyle, allowing her to live beyond her means while everyone around her died in agony. The trial was a media sensation. In 1952, female serial killers were rare, and one who targeted her own children was almost unheard of. The courtroom was packed as prosecutors laid out the evidence. The exhumed bodies, the arsenic findings, the pattern of deaths, the insurance policies, and Rhonda's own confession. The defense tried to argue insanity, suggesting that no sane mother could kill her own children. But the prosecution demonstrated that Rhonda's crimes were calculated, planned, and motivated by financial gain. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew it was wrong, and she did it anyway, over and over, for more than a decade. The jury deliberated for just a few hours before returning a guilty verdict on multiple counts of murder. The judge sentenced Rhonda Belle Martin to death in Alabama's electric chair. On October 11, 1957, Rhonda Belle Martin was executed at Kilby Prison in Montgomery, Alabama. She was 41 years old. To the end, she showed little remorse for the children she'd poisoned, the husbands she'd murdered, the mother she'd killed. She went to her death as coldly as she'd dealt death to others. The victims of Rhonda Belle Martin deserve to grow up, to grow old, to live full lives. Her children never got to experience first days of school, first loves, careers, families of their own. They died in pain and fear, betrayed by the one person who should have protected them above all others. Rhonda's legacy is one of betrayal, greed, and unimaginable evil. A reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one who tucks you into bed at night. This case shocked Alabama and the nation. If it's affecting you now, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe to Cold Case Revisited for more thoroughly researched true crime documentaries. Case 3. Heather Leavell-Keaton, the stepmother from hell. The word stepmother has unfairly carried negative connotations throughout history, thanks to fairy tales and cultural stereotypes. But in the case of Heather Leavell-Keaton, every dark fairy tale warning about evil stepmothers proved horrifyingly true. December of 2010. Mobile, Alabama. Police responded to a missing children report that would evolve into one of the most disturbing child abuse and murder cases in Alabama history. The DeBlaise children, 3-year-old Chase and 4-year-old Natalie, were nowhere to be found. Their father, John DeBlaise, and his girlfriend, Heather Leavell-Keaton, had conflicting stories about where the kids were. The more investigators dug, the worse it got. John DeBlaise and Heather Leavell-Keaton had been in a relationship for several years. John had 2 children from a previous relationship, Natalie and Chase. Their biological mother had lost custody, and the children lived with John and Heather. What should have been a chance for stability became a nightmare of abuse, torture, and ultimately, murder. Neighbors later told police that they rarely saw the DeBlaise children. When they did, the kids looked malnourished, bruised, and terrified. One neighbor reported hearing screaming coming from the home late at night. Not the normal sounds of children playing, but screams of pain and fear. Child Protective Services had been called multiple times, but somehow, the children remained in that house of horrors. When police finally got John DeBlaise and Heather Leavell-Keaton separated for questioning, the truth began to emerge. It was a truth so disturbing that seasoned detectives struggled to maintain their composure. Natalie and Chase had been subjected to systematic torture. They were beaten regularly. They were locked in closets for hours, sometimes days. They were denied food as punishment. Heather, their stepmother, was the primary abuser, though John was complicit through his inaction and, in some instances, his participation. In March of 2010, 4-year-old Natalie died. The exact cause was determined to be a combination of malnutrition, physical abuse, and neglect. Her little body had simply given out after months of torture. Instead of calling for help, instead of facing the consequences of their actions, John and Heather wrapped Natalie's body in trash bags and drove to a remote area near Citronelle, Alabama. They dumped her body in the woods like garbage. 3-year-old Chase had witnessed his sister's death. He knew what had happened to Natalie. And Heather Leavell-Keaton knew that Chase was a liability, a witness who could tell authorities what had happened. So in September of 2010, 6 months after Natalie's death, Heather murdered Chase too. The details of Chase's death are particularly brutal. According to court documents and confessions, Heather suffocated the 3-year-old boy. She held a bag over his head while he struggled, while he fought for breath, until he stopped moving. John DeBlaise was present. He did nothing to stop it. After Chase died, they took his body to another remote location in Mississippi and left him in the woods, just like they'd done with his sister. For months, John and Heather lived their lives as if nothing had happened. They told people the children were with relatives. They avoided questions. They moved around to evade scrutiny. But in December of 2010, someone finally called the police about the missing children. The investigation moved quickly once authorities realized the children hadn't been seen in months. Under interrogation, John DeBlaise broke first. He confessed to the disposal of the bodies, to the abuse, to standing by while Heather killed his children. He led police to where they'd dumped Natalie's remains in Alabama and Chase's remains in Mississippi. The condition of the bodies, left exposed to the elements for months, was heartbreaking. These babies had been thrown away like trash. Heather Leavell-Keaton was arrested and charged with 2 counts of capital murder. John DeBlaise was also charged with capital murder and child abuse. The prosecution had confessions, physical evidence, and a timeline that left no doubt about what had happened to Natalie and Chase. The trial revealed the full extent of the children's suffering. Medical experts testified about the malnutrition, about the injuries both old and new on the children's bodies, about the sustained pattern of abuse that had characterized their short lives. Teachers who'd briefly known the children testified about how they'd seemed withdrawn, frightened, hungry. A babysitter testified about seeing bruises and asking Heather about them, only to be told the children were clumsy. The jury heard about how Natalie, just 4 years old, had been beaten so badly and starved so severely that her body shut down. They heard about how 3-year-old Chase had been murdered to keep him quiet. They heard about bodies dumped in the woods, about months of lies and cover-ups, about 2 children who'd suffered more in their short lives than most people could imagine. Heather Leavell-Keaton showed no remorse during the trial. She sat stone-faced as witnesses described the torture she'd inflicted on children who'd called her a parental figure. When given the opportunity to speak, she offered no apology, no explanation that could possibly justify her actions. The jury found her guilty on all counts. During the sentencing phase, the aggravating factors were overwhelming. Multiple victims, both children, both helpless, both dependent on her for care. The murders were especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel. There were no mitigating factors substantial enough to outweigh the horror of her crimes. Heather Leavell-Keaton was sentenced to death. She was sent to Tutwiler Prison for Women to await execution on Alabama's death row, where she remains today. John DeBlaise, who cooperated with prosecutors and pled guilty, received life in prison without the possibility of parole. While his cooperation spared him the death penalty, he'll never see freedom again. He failed to protect his children, participated in their abuse, and helped dispose of their bodies. His sentence ensures he'll die behind bars. Natalie and Chase DeBlaise never had a chance. They were born into circumstances beyond their control, placed in the care of people who should have loved them, and instead suffered unimaginable abuse before being murdered and discarded. They were 4 and 3 years old. They should have been playing, learning, experiencing childhood. Instead, they experienced hell. Heather Leavell-Keaton proved that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it moves into your home, dates your parent, and destroys everything. She'll never see freedom again, and that's exactly as it should be. If you're finding value in these thoroughly investigated cases, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Revisited. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. Case 4. Lisa Leanne Graham, the mother who hired a hitman. Most mothers would do anything to protect their children. Lisa Leanne Graham did the opposite. She paid someone to murder her own daughter. Opelika, Alabama. 2007. 21-year-old Stephanie Shea Graham was a young woman trying to find her way in life. She had dreams, friends, and a complicated relationship with her mother, Lisa. That relationship would prove fatal. Lisa Leanne Graham was in her late 30s, divorced, and struggling financially. She'd taken out a life insurance policy on her daughter Shea, a $35,000 policy that listed Lisa as the beneficiary. To outsiders, it might have seemed like a reasonable precaution, a mother making sure her child would have a proper burial if something happened. But for Leyva, that policy represented something else entirely, a payday. By mid-2007, Leyva was in dire financial straits. She owed money to various creditors, faced potential eviction, and saw her lifestyle crumbling. She looked at that insurance policy on her daughter and made a decision that would shock investigators and the community. She would have Shay killed and collect the money. But Leyva Graham didn't have the stomach to kill her own daughter herself. So she went looking for someone who would. Enter Kenny Walton, a man with a criminal history and few scruples. Leyva approached Kenny with a proposition that sounded like something from a bad movie. She would pay him to kill her daughter. Kenny agreed. The amount discussed varied in different accounts, but court documents suggest it was a few $1,000s, a fraction of the insurance payout Leyva expected to receive. Leyva gave Kenny details about Shay's routine, where she lived, when she'd be vulnerable. She provided information only a mother would know, intimate details about her daughter's life that would make the murder easier to execute. She was planning her own child's death with the cold calculation of a mob boss ordering a hit. On May 19, 2007, Kenny Walton went to Shay Graham's residence. He confronted the 21-year-old woman and shot her multiple times. Shay died at the scene, her life ended by bullets paid for by her own mother. Leyva's plan immediately began to fall apart. When police investigated Shay's murder, they found no obvious motive. Shay wasn't involved in drugs or criminal activity. She didn't have enemies. She wasn't in a volatile relationship. The murder seemed random, motiveless, until investigators started looking at who would benefit from her death. The life insurance policy jumped out immediately. Leyva Graham stood to gain $35,000 from her daughter's murder. That alone made her a person of interest. When detectives began digging into Leyva's finances and recent activities, they discovered communications between Leyva and Kenny Walton. Phone records, witness statements, and financial transactions began to paint a picture of a murder-for-hire plot. Kenny Walton, facing the death penalty himself, decided to cooperate with prosecutors. He confessed to shooting Shay Graham, and, more damningly, he identified Leyva Graham as the person who'd hired him, planned it, and promised to pay him from the insurance money. The case against Leyva was built on Kenny's testimony, corroborated by phone records, financial documents, and the insurance policy. But there was another piece of evidence that sealed Leyva's fate, her behavior after Shay's death. Leyva had played the grieving mother at Shay's funeral. She cried, accepted condolences, spoke about her beloved daughter. But behind the scenes, she was already trying to collect on the insurance policy. Within days of Shay's murder, Leyva contacted the insurance company to begin the claims process. Her eagerness to collect the money raised red flags with investigators. When confronted by police, Leyva initially denied any involvement. But as the evidence mounted, Kenny's confession, the phone records, the insurance policy, her suspicious behavior, her denials rang hollow. In 2008, Leyva Leanne Graham was arrested and charged with capital murder for hire. The trial was relatively straightforward. The prosecution presented Kenny Walton as their star witness. He testified about how Leyva had approached him, how she'd provided information about Shay, how she'd promised payment, and how she'd wanted her own daughter dead for insurance money. The defense tried to attack Kenny's credibility, pointing to his criminal history and suggesting he was lying to save himself from the death penalty. But the corroborating evidence was too strong. The phone records showed contact between Leyva and Kenny before the murder. Leyva's financial desperation was well documented. The insurance policy was clear. And most damning of all, Leyva had tried to collect that insurance money while her daughter's body was barely cold. The jury heard testimony about Shay Graham, a young woman with her whole life ahead of her, who loved her family despite its dysfunction, who was trying to build a future. They heard about the moment she was shot, how she must have felt betrayed and terrified in her final moments. They heard about a mother who valued $35,000 more than her child's life. Leyva Leanne Graham was found guilty of capital murder for hire. The aggravating factors were clear. This was murder for pecuniary gain. It was especially heinous and atrocious, and it involved a complete betrayal of the parent-child bond. The jury recommended death, and the judge agreed. Leyva was sentenced to death and transported to Tutwiler Prison for Women, where she sits on death row to this day. Her appeals have been unsuccessful. The evidence against her is overwhelming, and the depravity of her crime leaves little room for sympathy. Kenny Walton, who pulled the trigger, pled guilty to murder and testified against Lisa. He received life in prison without parole in exchange for his cooperation. He'll never walk free, but he avoided the death penalty by helping to convict the woman who'd hired him. Shay Graham was 21 years old when her mother orchestrated her murder. She'll never turn 22, never fall in love, never have children of her own, never fulfill whatever potential she had. All because Lisa Graham looked at her daughter and saw nothing but a dollar amount. There's a special kind of evil in a parent who can arrange their child's murder and then attend the funeral with crocodile tears. Lisa Leanne Graham embodied that evil, and Alabama's justice system ensured she'll pay for it with her life. These cases remind us that evil can wear any face, even a mother's. If you're committed to hearing these stories told with truth and respect, hit that like button and subscribe to Cold Case Revisited. Case 5. Patricia Blackmon, Death by Pool Cue. Adoption should be about love, about giving a child in need a safe home and a family. For 2-year-old Dominiqua Bryant, adoption meant being placed in the hands of the woman who would beat her to death. Dothan, Alabama. May of 1999. Patricia Blackmon had recently adopted 2-year-old Dominiqua through a private adoption. To everyone who knew Patricia, she seemed like a devoted mother, a woman who was opening her home and heart to a child in need. But behind closed doors, something had gone terribly wrong. On May 30th, 1999, Patricia Blackmon called 911. She claimed that her adopted daughter Dominiqua had fallen and hurt herself. When paramedics arrived, they found the 2-year-old girl unresponsive, covered in bruises, with severe head trauma. Dominiqua was rushed to the hospital, but her injuries were too severe. She died shortly after arrival. The medical staff who treated Dominiqua were immediately suspicious. The injuries didn't match Patricia's story about a fall. The bruises were extensive, covering the child's body in various stages of healing, indicating prolonged abuse. The head trauma was severe and consistent with being struck repeatedly with a blunt object. This was no accident. This was a beating. When the medical examiner performed an autopsy on Dominiqua's tiny body, the findings were devastating. The 2-year-old had suffered multiple skull fractures, brain hemorrhaging, internal bleeding, broken ribs, and bruising over most of her body. Some injuries were recent, others were days or weeks old. Dominiqua had been systematically beaten for an extended period before the final, fatal assault. Detectives confronted Patricia Blackmon with the autopsy results. Her story about an accidental fall couldn't possibly explain the extent and pattern of injuries. Under pressure, Patricia's story changed. She admitted that she'd hit Dominiqua, but claimed it was disciplinary, that she'd lost her temper when the 2-year-old had a bathroom accident. But as the investigation continued, the truth emerged, a truth far more horrifying than even experienced detectives had imagined. Patricia Blackmon had beaten 2-year-old Dominiqua Bryant to death with a pool cue. According to evidence and Patricia's eventual confession, Dominiqua had wet herself. Instead of responding with patience or even normal discipline, Patricia flew into a rage. She grabbed a pool cue and began beating the toddler. She struck Dominiqua in the head, the body, the legs, anywhere and everywhere. The 2-year-old screamed and cried, but Patricia didn't stop. She beat that baby so severely that the pool cue broke. And even then, she continued. When Dominiqua finally fell unconscious, Patricia waited. She didn't call for help immediately. She waited, perhaps hoping the child would wake up and she could avoid getting caught. But when Dominiqua's condition didn't improve, when it became clear the injuries were life-threatening, only then did Patricia call 911 with her fabricated story about a fall. The investigation also revealed that this wasn't the first time Patricia had abused Dominiqua. Neighbors reported hearing screaming from the house. Teachers at Dominiqua's daycare had noticed bruises and asked about them, only to be given explanations about the child being clumsy. There were signs, red flags that should have triggered intervention. But somehow, Dominiqua remained in Patricia's care until it was too late. Patricia Blackmon was arrested and charged with capital murder. The trial began in 2000, and the evidence presented was overwhelming. Medical experts testified about the severity of Dominiqua's injuries, explaining that the force required to inflict such damage was enormous, far beyond any reasonable discipline. They testified that the child would have been in agony, that she would have suffered tremendously before losing consciousness. The broken pool cue was entered into evidence, a silent witness to the brutality inflicted on a 2-year-old child. The jury saw photographs of Dominiqua's injuries, images that made grown adults weep. They heard about a woman who'd adopted a child in need and then tortured her to death over a bathroom accident. The defense attempted to argue that Patricia had mental health issues, that she'd been under stress, that she hadn't intended to kill Dominiqua. But the prosecution demonstrated that this wasn't a moment of lost control. The beating had been prolonged, sustained, and brutal. Patricia had multiple opportunities to stop, to get help, to show mercy. She chose violence instead. Perhaps most damning was Patricia's behavior after the beating. She'd waited to call for help, then lied to first responders and doctors about what had happened. She'd shown consciousness of guilt, an awareness that what she'd done was criminal. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a mental health episode. This was murder. The jury found Patricia Blackmon guilty of capital murder. During the sentencing phase, the aggravating factors were presented. Dominiqua was especially vulnerable, a 2-year-old child completely dependent on her adoptive mother for care and protection. The murder was especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel. The child had been beaten with a pool cue until the weapon broke. There was a pattern of abuse leading up to the murder. The breach of trust was total. This was an adoptive mother who'd promised to care for a child in need. The jury recommended death. The judge agreed, calling the crime one of the most disturbing cases of child abuse he'd ever encountered. Patricia Blackmon was sentenced to death and sent to Tutwiler Prison for Women, where she remains on Alabama's death row. Her appeals have focused on claims of mental illness and ineffective counsel, but the courts have consistently denied relief. The evidence of her guilt is simply too overwhelming, and the brutality of her crime too extreme to warrant leniency. 2-year-old Dominiqua Bryant never had a chance to grow up. She never got to go to kindergarten, never got to make friends, never got to experience the childhood she deserved. She was placed in an adoptive home that should have been her safe haven, and instead, it became her torture chamber. She died in pain and fear at the hands of the woman who'd promised to be her mother. Patricia Blackmon took a sacred responsibility, caring for an adopted child, and turned it into a nightmare. She'll never leave prison alive, and that's the only justice Dominiqua will ever receive. If these stories are impacting you, if you believe in keeping these victims' memories alive through truth, please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Revisited. We're committed to thorough, verified reporting on these difficult cases. Case 6, Tierra Capri Gobble, 4 months of life, ended in rage. The youngest victim in our investigation was only 4 months old when his mother decided he didn't deserve to live. His name was Phoenix, and his short life ended in violence at the hands of Tierra Capri Gobble. Gadsden, Alabama, November of 2004. Tierra Capri Gobble was 19 years old and a new mother to 4-month-old Phoenix. By all accounts, motherhood hadn't come easily to Tierra. She struggled with the constant demands of an infant, the sleepless nights, the crying, the feeding schedules. But millions of mothers face these challenges every day without harming their children. Tierra was different. On November 11, 2004, Tierra called 911, reporting that her baby wasn't breathing. Paramedics rushed to the scene and found infant Phoenix unresponsive. He was transported to the hospital, but despite medical intervention, Phoenix died from his injuries. The medical examination revealed the horrific truth. Phoenix had been beaten. The 4-month-old baby had suffered severe head trauma, broken ribs, and internal injuries consistent with blunt force trauma. His skull had been fractured. His brain was hemorrhaging. This tiny infant had been subjected to violence so extreme that his body couldn't survive it. When investigators questioned Tierra, her initial story was that Phoenix had fallen or accidentally been injured. But the medical evidence made that impossible. The injuries were too severe, too numerous, too consistent with intentional battery. Someone had beaten this baby, and Tierra was the only person with access and opportunity. Under intensive interrogation, Tierra's story changed multiple times. She eventually admitted that Phoenix had been crying, a normal behavior for a 4-month-old infant, and she'd become frustrated. In her frustration, she'd shaken him violently. But the injuries couldn't be explained by shaking alone. Forensic evidence suggested that Phoenix had been struck, possibly thrown or slammed against the surface. The investigation painted a picture of a young mother overwhelmed by the responsibilities of parenthood, but instead of seeking help, instead of reaching out to family or services designed to support struggling parents, Tierra had turned her frustration into violence against a helpless infant. Phoenix's injuries indicated this likely wasn't the first time he'd been hurt. Some of the rib fractures showed signs of healing, suggesting they'd occurred days or weeks before the fatal assault. This baby had been suffering, and nobody had intervened in time to save him. Tierra Capri Gobble was arrested and charged with capital murder. At just 19 years old, she was facing the death penalty for killing her own infant son. The trial in 2006 was emotionally devastating. The jury saw photographs of Phoenix's injuries, images that made it impossible to view Tierra as anything other than what she was, a child killer. Medical experts testified about the force required to inflict such injuries on an infant, the pain Phoenix would have experienced, the absolute defenselessness of a 4-month-old baby. Prosecutors argued that Tierra had murdered Phoenix because he'd inconvenienced her, because his crying had annoyed her, because she couldn't handle the normal demands of motherhood. They presented evidence of the injuries, the changing stories, and Tierra's own admissions about losing her temper with the baby. The defense attempted to portray Tierra as a young, overwhelmed mother who'd made a tragic mistake. They argued for leniency based on her age and lack of maturity. But the prosecution countered that age didn't excuse brutality, that plenty of 19-year-old mothers managed to care for their infants without beating them to death. The jury found Tierra Capri Gobble guilty of capital murder. During sentencing, the aggravating factors were presented. Phoenix was an infant, completely helpless and dependent on his mother for survival. The murder was especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel. A 4-month-old baby beaten so severely that his body failed. There was evidence of prior abuse in the healing fractures. The breach of trust was total. This was a mother who'd been responsible for protecting her child. The jury recommended death. The judge, citing the particularly vulnerable nature of the victim and the brutality of the crime, agreed. Tierra Capri Gobble was sentenced to death at age 19, becoming one of the youngest women on Alabama's death row. She was transferred to Tutwiler Prison for Women, where she remains today, more than 20 years after murdering her son. Her appeals have argued ineffective counsel, her young age at the time of the crime, and claims that she didn't receive a fair trial. Every appeal has been denied. The evidence against her is insurmountable, and the courts have found no grounds to overturn her sentence. Phoenix would be 21 years old now if his mother hadn't killed him at 4 months old. He never got to smile, never got to laugh, never got to say his first word or take his first step. His entire existence was pain and fear, ended by the person who should have loved him most. Tierra Capri Gobble sits on death row, aging while her son remains forever 4 months old in death. She'll never experience the milestones Phoenix was denied. She'll never hold another baby, never walk freely outside prison walls, never escape the consequences of what she did. The tragedy of Phoenix's death reminds us that the most vulnerable among us depend entirely on adults to protect them. When those adults fail, or worse, when they become the predators, justice demands accountability. If this case has moved you, if you believe these stories need to be told, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to Cold Case Revisited. Every subscription helps us continue this important work. Case 7. Evelyn Leyva Etress, the unsecured firearm. Not all the cases we're examining today involve direct violence by a mother against her child. Some involve criminal negligence so severe, so reckless, that it crosses the line into criminal homicide. Evelyn Leyva Etress's case is one of those, and it's still making its way through Alabama's court system. January of 2026, just weeks ago. A Huntsville, Alabama home became the scene of a preventable tragedy that has shocked the community and resulted in criminal charges against a mother whose negligence cost her son his life. 2-year-old Noah Etress was at home with his siblings when the unthinkable happened. One of Noah's siblings, a child, found an unsecured, loaded firearm in the home. Exactly how the child accessed the gun is part of the ongoing investigation, but what's not in dispute is what happened next. The child, not understanding the deadly nature of firearms, picked up the gun and it discharged, shooting 2-year-old Noah. When emergency services arrived, they found Noah suffering from a gunshot wound. He was rushed to the hospital, but his injuries were too severe. 2-year-old Noah Etress died from the gunshot, a victim of adult negligence and a loaded, accessible firearm. The investigation immediately focused on how a child had been able to access a loaded gun. In Alabama, as in every state, gun owners have a responsibility to secure their firearms, especially in homes with children. Leaving a loaded gun where children can access it isn't just dangerous. Under certain circumstances, it's criminal. Evelyn Leyva Etress, Noah's mother, was at home when the shooting occurred. According to charging documents, the firearm belonged to someone in the household, and it had been left unsecured and accessible to the children. Whether Evelyn owned the gun herself or lived with someone who did, the law holds her responsible as the parent for ensuring her children's safety. On January 9, 2026, Evelyn Leyva Etress was arrested and charged with aggravated child abuse and manslaughter. The charges reflect the prosecution's theory that Noah's death wasn't a pure accident. It was the foreseeable result of criminal negligence. When you leave a loaded gun where children can reach it, when you fail to secure deadly weapons in a home with toddlers, and when that failure results in a child's death, Alabama law treats it as a crime. The details of exactly how the gun was stored, who owned it, and what safety measures, if any, were in place haven't been fully released yet, as the case is still pending trial. But the fact that charges were filed indicates that prosecutors believe the evidence shows criminal negligence rising to the level of manslaughter. This case is different from most others we've covered today because Evelyn isn't accused of directly harming Noah. She didn't beat him, didn't poison him, didn't set him on fire. But the prosecution's argument is that her failure to secure a deadly weapon in a home with small children was so reckless, so negligent, that it constitutes criminal behavior worthy of serious punishment. Gun safety advocates have pointed to Noah's case as an example of why secure storage laws are critical. Every year, hundreds of children in America are injured or killed in accidental shootings, many of them involving unsecured firearms in the home. When those incidents result from criminal negligence, prosecutors increasingly are holding adults accountable. The legal standard for manslaughter in Alabama requires proof that a person caused another's death through criminal negligence or recklessness. Criminal negligence is more than just carelessness. It's a gross deviation from the standard of care that a reasonable person would exercise. Leaving a loaded gun accessible to toddlers would likely meet that standard in the eyes of most legal experts. As of this recording, Evelyn Leyva Etress's case is ongoing. She has not gone to trial yet, and she's entitled to the presumption of innocence until proven guilty. Her defense attorneys may argue that the shooting was a pure accident, that reasonable safety measures were in place, or that she's not criminally responsible for another person's failure to secure the weapon. But if convicted, Evelyn faces serious prison time. Manslaughter in Alabama can carry a sentence of 2 to 20 years in prison. Aggravated child abuse adds additional potential penalties. While she may not face the death penalty like several other mothers on our list, Evelyn could still spend much or all of her remaining life behind bars. The broader implications of this case extend beyond Evelyn herself. Noah's death is a reminder that gun ownership comes with serious responsibilities, especially in homes with children. Firearms must be secured, locked, unloaded, with ammunition stored separately when not in use. Gun safes, trigger locks, and secure storage aren't just good ideas. In cases like this, they're the difference between life and death. 2-year-old Noah Etress should be alive. He should be playing with toys, learning new words, experiencing the joy of childhood. Instead, he's dead because adults in his home failed to keep a deadly weapon away from children. Whether that failure rises to the level of criminal manslaughter is for a jury to decide. But there's no dispute about the central tragedy, a preventable death of a child who deserved protection. The investigation continues. The trial will happen, and Evelyn Leyva Etress will face a reckoning for her role in her son's death. Unlike some cases where mothers actively murdered their children, Evelyn's case involves negligence and failure to protect. But the result is the same, a dead child and a mother who will likely never see freedom again. This case is still developing, and we'll continue to follow it as it moves through the court system. If you want to stay updated on this and other verified true crime cases, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Revisited for ongoing coverage. Case 8. Jamesia Brichae Pruitt, the newest tragedy. Our next case is heartbreakingly recent, so fresh that the investigation is still active and many details remain under wraps. But what we know already is disturbing enough to earn Jamesia Brichae Pruitt a place on this list of Alabama's most evil mothers. January of 2025, just over a year ago. Dothan, Alabama. 4-month-old Nehemiah Pruitt was rushed to the hospital with life-threatening injuries. Medical staff worked frantically to save the infant's life, but Nehemiah's injuries were too severe. The 4-month-old baby died, and the circumstances of his death immediately raised red flags. When doctors examined Nehemiah, they found injuries consistent with non-accidental trauma. The baby had suffered severe head injuries, possible internal trauma, and other signs that pointed to abuse rather than accident. The medical team contacted law enforcement, and an investigation was launched immediately. Jamesia Brichae Pruitt, Nehemiah's mother, was the primary caregiver at the time the fatal injuries occurred. According to initial reports, Jamesia claimed the baby had been injured accidentally. The specifics of her story haven't been publicly released in detail, but investigators quickly determined that her explanation didn't match the medical evidence. The autopsy on Nehemiah's tiny body revealed the truth. This was not an accident. The 4-month-old infant had been subjected to violence, and that violence had killed him. Based on the medical examiner's findings and the investigative evidence, Dothan police arrested Jamesia Brichae Pruitt and charged her with murder. At just 23 years old, Jamesia is now facing one of the most serious charges in Alabama's criminal code, the murder of her own infant son. The case is still in its early stages, with much of the evidence sealed as the prosecution builds its case. But the fact that murder charges were filed, rather than lesser charges like manslaughter or negligent homicide, indicates that investigators believe Jamesia intentionally caused Nehemiah's death or acted with depraved indifference to his life. What we know from similar cases is that when infants die from non-accidental trauma, the injuries typically include severe head trauma from shaking or impact, internal injuries from blunt force, or a combination of multiple traumatic injuries. 4-month-old babies are entirely helpless. They can't defend themselves. They can't escape. They can't even cry out in a way that would bring help from neighbors or passersby. They're completely at the mercy of their caregivers. The community of Dothan has been rocked by Nehemiah's death. Neighbors and family members have expressed shock, with some saying they had no idea anything was wrong, while others hinted at concerns they'd had but never reported. It's a familiar pattern in child abuse cases, warning signs that were either missed or ignored until it was too late. Jamesia Brichae Pruitt is currently in jail awaiting trial. The prosecution will have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that she caused Nehemiah's death and that she did so with the requisite mental state for murder, either intentionally, knowingly, or with depraved indifference to human life. The defense will likely challenge the cause of death, argue that the injuries could have been accidental, or claim that someone else had access to the baby and could have caused the fatal injuries. If convicted of murder, Jamesia faces life in prison. Alabama's sentencing for murder ranges from 20 years to life, and given that the victim was an infant and the defendant was the child's mother, the likelihood of a lenient sentence seems remote. She may not face the death penalty. Capital murder charges would require additional aggravating factors beyond the age of the victim, but she could easily spend the rest of her life behind bars. The case is expected to go to trial sometime in 2026, though delays are common in murder cases as both sides prepare their evidence and arguments. The trial will likely feature testimony from medical examiners, child abuse experts, investigators who interviewed Jamesia, and possibly witnesses who had contact with Nehemiah before his death. What makes this case particularly tragic is how preventable it was. Nehemiah was only 4 months old. He'd barely begun his life. If his mother was struggling with the demands of caring for an infant, there were resources available: family support, community programs, social services designed specifically to help overwhelmed parents. But instead of seeking help, instead of ensuring Nehemiah's safety, Jamesia allegedly chose violence. The investigation is ongoing. More details will emerge as the case proceeds to trial. But one fact is already clear. 4-month-old Nehemiah Pruitt is dead. His mother is charged with his murder, and if convicted, she'll join the ranks of Alabama mothers who will never see freedom again. We'll continue to follow this case and provide updates as they become available. For the latest on Jamesia Pruitt's trial and other developing cases, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Revisited. Case 9. Shardee McGill, Murder-Suicide Tragedy. Not every case on our list ends with a trial and a prison sentence. Sometimes, the perpetrator ensures there will never be a day in court, never be accountability under law. Shardee McGill's case is one of those tragedies, a murder-suicide that left a 3-year-old girl dead and a community searching for answers that will never fully come. September of 2024. Mobile, Alabama. 34-year-old Shardee McGill was known to friends and family as a devoted mother to her 3-year-old daughter, Janae. But behind the facade of maternal devotion, something had gone terribly wrong. Whether it was mental illness, desperation, or something darker, we may never fully know. What we do know is that on a September day, Shardee made a decision that would end 2 lives. The details of what happened are pieced together from the investigation conducted after the bodies were discovered. Shardee took her daughter Janae to a body of water in the Mobile area. What happened next was a planned, deliberate act. Shardee drowned 3-year-old Janae, then took her own life by drowning as well. When their bodies were recovered, the medical examiner confirmed that both had died from drowning. But the investigation revealed that Janae's death came first. This wasn't a situation where a mother and child accidentally drowned together. The evidence showed that Shardee had intentionally drowned her daughter before ending her own life. The question that haunts everyone who knew them is, why? What could drive a mother to kill her own child, and then herself? In the aftermath of the murder-suicide, family members and friends were interviewed by police and media, trying to make sense of the senseless. Some indicated that Shardee had been struggling with personal issues, possibly relationship problems, possibly financial stress, possibly mental health challenges. But many people struggle with these issues without harming their children. What made Shardee different? What pushed her over the edge from struggling mother to murderer? Murder-suicides involving parents and children are among the most tragic cases in true crime. Often, the parent convinces themselves that they're somehow protecting the child from future suffering, or that the child is better off dead than living without the parent. It's a warped, destructive logic that results in the murder of innocent children who had no say in the decision. 3-year-old Janae McGill was at an age where life was just beginning to make sense. She was forming sentences, making friends, developing her personality. She had no concept of the troubles her mother faced, no ability to consent to her own death, no chance to choose a different path. Shardee made that decision for her, and it was murder, plain and simple. The Mobile Police Department investigated the deaths as a homicide-suicide. In such cases, there's no arrest because the perpetrator is dead. There's no trial because there's no defendant. The case is closed with a determination of what happened, but there's no formal justice process, no opportunity for Janae's other family members to confront Shardee or to hear her explain herself in court. This is one of the frustrating realities of murder-suicides. The perpetrator escapes accountability by taking their own life. There's no prison sentence, no execution, no day of reckoning. The families of victims are left with grief and unanswered questions that will haunt them forever. In the wake of Janae's death, her extended family held a memorial service. They spoke about a bright, loving child who brought joy to everyone around her. They remembered her laughter, her curiosity, her potential. They also grappled with the reality that Janae's own mother had stolen all of that away. Some family members expressed anger at Shardee for what she'd done. Others tried to frame it as a mental health tragedy, suggesting that Shardee wasn't in her right mind when she killed Janae and herself. But regardless of Shardee's mental state, the result is the same: a dead child whose life was stolen by the person who should have protected her above all others. Mental health advocates have pointed to cases like Shardee and Janae's as evidence of the need for better mental health resources, especially for struggling parents. If Shardee was suffering from depression, psychosis, or another mental illness, she should have had access to treatment that might have prevented this tragedy. But even with the best mental health care in the world, there will always be cases where someone chooses violence over help, destruction over healing. The investigation into Shardee and Janae's deaths is closed. The medical examiner has issued death certificates. The bodies have been buried. But the trauma of their deaths lingers in the Mobile community and in the hearts of Janae's surviving family members. While Shardee technically didn't never see freedom again because she chose death over accountability, the spirit of her inclusion on this list remains. She committed an act so evil, so fundamentally wrong, that she would have deserved to spend the rest of her life in prison had she survived. By taking her own life, she cheated justice, but she also ensured her own end. She'll never see freedom again because she's dead, killed by her own hand after murdering her 3-year-old daughter. 3-year-old Janae McGill deserved a full life. She deserved to grow up, to go to school, to make friends, to experience all the joys and challenges of childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. Instead, she got 3 years of life cut short by a mother who decided that Janae didn't deserve to live. Murder-suicides are among the most difficult cases to process because there's no clear path to justice, no satisfying conclusion. But we tell these stories anyway because Janae's life mattered, because her death was wrong, and because maybe, just maybe, hearing these stories will encourage someone who's struggling to seek help before it's too late. If this case has affected you, if you believe in honoring victims by telling their stories truthfully, please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Revisited. Case 10. Kristy Marie Siple, sold into death. Our final case is perhaps the most disturbing of all because it involves not just murder, but the calculated selling of a child into sexual slavery that ended in that child's death. Kristy Marie Siple didn't pull the trigger or wield the weapon, but she arranged for her 5-year-old daughter to be raped and murdered for money. Columbus, Georgia, and Phoenix City, Alabama. December of 2021. 5-year-old Camari Holland was a kindergartner living with her mother, Kristy Marie Siple, in Columbus, Georgia. Camari should have been safe with her mother. Instead, Kristy was actively selling sexual access to her 5-year-old daughter to predators. One of those predators was Jeremy Tremaine Williams, a 37-year-old man from Phoenix City, Alabama, just across the state line from Columbus. Williams had paid Kristy for access to Camari multiple times, engaging in the repeated rape and sexual abuse of the little girl. Kristy knew exactly what was happening to her daughter. She facilitated it. She profited from it. She allowed a pedophile to repeatedly assault her 5-year-old child. On December 13, 2021, Kristy arranged for Williams to pick up Camari. She handed her daughter over to a man she knew was a sexual predator, a man who'd already abused Camari multiple times. Kristy received payment. Reports vary on the exact amount, but it was somewhere between $100 and $200. For that price, Kristy sold her daughter to be raped. Jeremy Williams took Camari to his home in Phoenix City, Alabama. What happened there is almost too horrific to recount. Williams raped 5-year-old Camari, then strangled her to death. He disposed of her body in a vacant building, leaving the little girl like garbage. When Camari didn't come home, Kristy reported her missing. She played the worried mother, claiming she didn't know where her daughter was. But investigators quickly uncovered the truth. Phone records, financial transactions, and witness statements revealed that Kristy had been sex trafficking her own daughter and that she'd given Camari to Williams on the day she disappeared. Williams was arrested and charged with capital murder, kidnapping, and sexual abuse. He confessed to killing Camari and led police to her body. The autopsy confirmed what investigators feared. Camari had been sexually assaulted before being strangled to death. The 5-year-old girl had suffered immeasurably before finally dying at the hands of the monster her mother had sold her to. Kristy Marie Siple was also arrested, initially charged with murder, human trafficking, and sexual abuse. The evidence against her was overwhelming. She'd received payments for allowing Williams to abuse Camari. She'd facilitated the encounters, sometimes even transporting Camari to Williams herself. She'd known exactly what was happening and had allowed it to continue for money. As the case against both Williams and Kristy developed, prosecutors faced a decision. They had Williams dead to rights on the murder. He'd confessed, led them to the body, and physical evidence confirmed his guilt. With Kristy, the case was more complex. She hadn't personally killed Camari, though her actions had directly led to the child's death. Prosecutors decided to pursue a plea agreement. In exchange for Kristy's cooperation in the case against Jeremy Williams and her guilty plea to federal sex trafficking charges, prosecutors agreed to drop the murder charge. This decision was controversial and infuriated many in the public who felt that Kristy was equally responsible for Camari's death. But prosecutors argued that securing Christie's testimony against Williams ensured he would face justice, and that the federal trafficking charges carried severe penalties that would still keep Kristy in prison for decades. In November of 2023, Christie Marie Siple pled guilty to sex trafficking of a child and production of child sexual abuse material. She was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. While this sentence seems lenient given her role in her daughter's death, it means Kristy will be in her mid-50s before she's released, if she lives that long. Jeremy Tremaine Williams was tried for capital murder in Alabama. The trial was swift and the verdict unsurprising. In September of 2023, Williams was convicted of capital murder in the death of Camari Holland. The jury recommended death, and the judge sentenced Williams to death by lethal injection. He currently sits on Alabama's death row, awaiting execution for the rape and murder of a 5-year-old girl. The case of Camari Holland shocked both Georgia and Alabama, sparking conversations about child protection, mandatory reporting, and the failures of systems designed to keep children safe. Camari had been in her mother's custody despite previous concerns. Teachers had noticed things about Camari that concerned them. She seemed withdrawn, sometimes came to school tired or disheveled. But these red flags weren't enough to trigger intervention that could have saved her. 5-year-old Camari Holland loved school. She loved playing with her friends. She loved her stuffed animals and Disney movies. She should have been safe with her mother, but instead, her mother commodified her, sold her body to a pedophile, and facilitated her rape and murder for a couple $100s. Christie Marie Siple may have avoided a murder conviction through her plea deal, but she'll still spend the next 2 decades in federal prison. She'll be a pariah among inmates. Child sex traffickers are despised, even in prison populations. She'll never regain the trust of her community, her family, or the public. And while 20 years may not seem like enough for facilitating her daughter's rape and murder, it ensures that Christie's freedom is severely limited for a significant portion of her remaining life. When she's finally released, if she survives federal prison, Kristy will be a registered sex offender, subject to monitoring and restrictions for the rest of her life. She'll never be allowed around children unsupervised. She'll struggle to find housing or employment. Her name will forever be associated with one of the most depraved crimes in recent Alabama and Georgia history. As for Jeremy Williams, he'll likely be executed within the next several years as his appeals exhaust themselves. He'll die for what he did to Camari, and few will mourn him. Camari Holland was 5 years old. She was in kindergarten. She was learning to read. She was making friends. She had her whole life ahead of her. And her own mother sold her into a hell that ended in her death. That betrayal is almost incomprehensible, but it's real, it's documented, and it's the reason Christie Marie Siple, though not technically sentenced to life without parole, has earned her place on this list of Alabama's most evil mothers. These 10 cases represent evil at its most fundamental level. If these stories have moved you, if you believe in keeping victims' memories alive and demanding justice, please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Revisited. We've reached the end of our examination of 10 Alabama mothers whose crimes were so heinous, so unforgivable, that they'll never see freedom again. Some sit on death row, awaiting execution for murdering their children. Others are serving life sentences without parole. One died by her own hand after killing her daughter. And one will spend decades in federal prison for trafficking her child to a killer. These cases are real. Every detail has been verified through court documents, trial transcripts, news reports, and official records. These aren't sensationalized stories or urban legends. These are verified crimes committed by real people against real children who deserved so much better. As we've seen throughout this documentary, evil doesn't always announce itself. It can wear a mother's face, speak in soothing tones, and hide behind the facade of normalcy. Kristy Scott seemed like a struggling single mother until she set fire to her autistic son. Rhonda Belle Martin played the grieving widow and mother while poisoning her family with rat poison. Lisa Graham appeared devoted to her daughter while planning her murder for insurance money. The common thread in all these cases is the absolute betrayal of trust. A child's relationship with their mother is supposed to be the safest, most nurturing bond in human experience. When that bond is not just broken but weaponized, when a mother becomes a child's murderer, it violates something fundamental about how we understand family and protection. These cases also highlight the importance of vigilance in our communities. In several cases, Leavell-Keaton, Patricia Blackmon, Tierra Gobble, there were signs of abuse that were noticed but not acted upon in time. Teachers saw bruises. Neighbors heard screaming. Family members had concerns. But for various reasons, fear of interfering, uncertainty about what they were seeing, or simple failure to follow through, these warning signs didn't result in intervention that could have saved children's lives. If you see something that concerns you about a child's welfare, report it. Call Child Protective Services. Contact law enforcement. You might be wrong. You might face awkwardness or pushback, but you also might save a life. The children in these cases didn't have anyone who advocated for them strongly enough, soon enough, and it cost them everything. For the mothers currently on Alabama's death row, Christy Scott, Leavell-Keaton, Lisa Graham, Patricia Blackmon, and Tierra Gobble, their appeals continue, but the likelihood of their sentences being overturned is minimal. The evidence against each of them is overwhelming, and the courts have repeatedly denied their claims. They will likely be executed in the coming years, ending their lives just as they ended their children's lives. For mothers serving life sentences or long-term sentences in federal prison, like Kristy Siple, they faced decades behind bars, aging in confinement, never experiencing the freedoms most of us take for granted. And for the children, Mason Scott, Rhonda Martin's victims, Natalie and Chase DeBlaise, Shay Graham, Dominique Bryant, Phoenix Gobble, Noah Etress, Nehemiah Pruitt, Janae McGill, and Kamari Holland. They exist now only in memories, photographs, and official records. They never got their chance at life. They were stolen from the world by the women who should have protected them. This is Cold Case Revisited, where we examine the cases that haunt us, that challenge our understanding of human nature, and that demand we remember the victims. If you've made it this far, thank you for bearing witness to these difficult stories. If you found value in this deep dive into verified true crime cases, please hit that like button, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel for more thoroughly researched documentaries on cases that matter. Remember, these stories aren't entertainment. They're tragedies. They're cautionary tales. They're reminders that evil exists, that children are vulnerable, and that justice, though sometimes delayed, eventually comes for those who harm the innocent. Until next time, stay vigilant, protect the vulnerable, and never forget the victims whose stories we've told today.